Just 10 sec.
Sure, no problem. I'll just introduce everyone. Thank you everyone for coming, both panelists and attendees. Today we're going to be talking about censorship as it relates to migration. We've got some brilliant panelists who have approached this from very different kind of backgrounds and very different perspectives. And I'll just quickly introduce them and then we will leap into the first question. To the attendees, I'd just like to say that we've got a Q&A section, which you can find in the bar at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And we'd love to receive any questions you may have. So anything that's been on your mind since you saw this, or anything that any of our panelists raise that you'd like to ask about further, please do ask and I will relay them to our panelists. So without further ado, our panelists are Nina Gheddar, who is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Guiti News, which is an independent media outlet created by fellow refugees along with French reporters in order to challenge the narrative surrounding migration. We also have Gulwali Passarlay, who is the author of the best-selling book The Lightless Sky, which I have right here. It's brilliant and you should all read it if you haven't already. And he's also an award-winning activist and campaigner, the co-founder of My Bright Kite, and a member of the Speakers Collective. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Lucy Williams, who is a freelance researcher and senior visiting research fellow at the University of Kent. And she's been involved in community work and research with refugees and asylum seekers in the UK since 1998. So we've got a brilliant panel here. And if it's okay with all of you, we can leap straight into the discussion. The first question is, how would you define censorship as it relates to migration? Gulwali, would you like to start us off?
Hi, good evening. Thanks for having us, and it's good to be with you. I feel like Lucy and Nina are the expert on this topic, but anyhow, I think censorship for me generally is about silencing people and their voices. Like we see it, for example. I know you ask in migration aspects, but we see it in Myanmar at the moment, in Burma with the military crackdown in the coup, and then we see it in China against the Uyghur Muslims, and elsewhere in Kashmir, and other authoritarian regimes are using it. But more so recently, I mean, in Europe, and particularly in the UK, the government has been using a lot of misinformation to counter, to the narratives and create fear and hatred towards refugees and migrants. And I've been reading a lot of reports about the Ken barricades where asylum seekers have been housed recently, and they've been threatened by the company or by whomever that if they speak out, because they've been speaking to the media and sending out letters and tweets and stuff, if they continue to speak out, it will impact their asylum cases. So there is a kind of a blackmail going on, and also we see it in Greece with the Greek government want to bring laws where they want to persecute activists and humanitarians for speaking out. And I think it's usually to do with censorship comes about because the government is afraid, or the people who is silencing the activists or whomever, because they know they're doing something wrong and they want the world not to see it. So I feel like in the UK and Europe, we see it in Hungary, in a lot of places in Croatia, where the government will not accept their actions in the way they've been treating migrants and refugees and so on. So I feel like there was another good example in migrants terms, the Stansted 15, the people who stopped a deportation flight to Nigeria from Stansted. They were then persecuted, not just any type of persecution, they were then persecuted and charged under terrorism laws. But then, thankfully, they recently, the High Court made a decision to say that was a bit too much and rubbish. So now, humanitarianism and social actions and speaking out and being a voice for the voiceless has been criminalized. And we see it with so many other cases of where these people who rescue refugees in the Mediterranean has been criminalized by the Italian governments, by the Greek and Maltese government and others. So yeah, I feel like it's about not only silencing people to share their views and their situation and conditions, but also it's deliberately done to undermine the work that NGOs and human rights organizations do for human rights and refugees' rights.
Absolutely. I think that's hugely important that the Stansted 15 were acquitted of the terrorism charges. And we've seen similar examples of, I suppose you could call it suppressive or suppressive cases against activists in Greece and Italy and elsewhere as well. And it really is designed to try and stop people actually doing what needs to be done. Lucy, have you got anything to add to that?
Yes, thank you. No, I think I'm very much with Gulwali on what you've said so far, and certainly, I mean, I went back to looking at the dictionary definition of censorship, which is kind of what I do as an academic, I suppose, and in that, it is about, you know, the dictionary definition, which quite surprised me, you know, puts suppression there as that it is about suppression. It's about prohibition of certain forms of information. And I think as an academic, I'm particularly interested in looking at both the agency of the migrant, but also the structure of the policies that migrants operate within. And I mean, that would also include the structures that activists and all sorts of other people work within. And I think if looked at in that respect, the structure censors the way people act and the way people speak by imposing an agenda on the information that we have. So, and I think by that it's very much things like, you know, how frequently we hear talk of illegal migration. And I'm sure we all understand, you know, how can a person be illegal and it's not illegal and all of this kind of stuff. But those kind of very powerful ideas about migration really limit conversation and really limit discussion. And it's that kind of simplistic talking that effectively censors censors our understanding about migration and just limits the way that we can even operate. So I think it's about censorship in migration really is creating a kind of atmosphere that inhibits discussion and inhibits our recognition of what migration is really about. So I think I'm sure we'll get onto it, there's an awful lot of activity that needs to come up from below, but I think we need to be very critical about what's happening on top, which is what creates this environment of suppression, of prohibition, of censorship. So I suppose that would be my opening points.
Oh, thank you. I think that's a really good point, that a lot of it is around the discourse and the narrative that's created. And I suspect that will also feed really well into some of what Nina has to say as well, who's very much looking at this from the media perspective. Nina, would you like to add to this?
Sure. Thanks for having me today. Yeah, I'd like to say that as a reporter, as an editor working in France, in Paris, on this particular topic, well, we have seen many attempts to make reporters' job harder in this past months and years. And I'd like to start with a concrete example of that. Last December, two reporters working in the north of France, in the city of Calais, Grande-Sainte, and Coquelles, they were covering migrant camps, and they were prevented on 5 occasions by the police to do their job. So what happened exactly? The policemen place their hands hiding their lenses so that they cannot take pictures, or they use car headlights to turn them into the direction of cameras. And we were actually talking about that with National Union of Journalists here in France. And they were basically saying that over the past 2 years, we have witnesses that 200 reporters have been prevented to do their jobs on the field. And well, the union was basically saying that, well, reporters have always had difficulties with the police, but 200 basically is impunity. And it's even harder for reporters given the status. For instance, a lot of reporters are working as freelancers, and it's even trickier for them because they haven't, well, they cannot have the same kind of support, you know, from the newsroom, for instance. And well, if we don't have them, we don't have witnesses from our society. So it's really a thing we have to keep in mind. And the second thing I'd like to say is, well, once again, giving my position, like in France, I won't say that there's a proper censorship in covering this topic, but I would say that there is a self-censorship for some editors or some reporters. Well, in the wake of the Me Too movement, we also had in France the same thing, also inside newsroom, you know, when we have witnesses that a lot of racist and discriminatory comments and acts were actually highlighted by some editors. And well, some of them were directed to migrant people, and some editors actually considered that migrants as a topic is not interesting. It's not worth the headlines. It's not selling because, to quote them, it's not sexy enough. But that's a thing we've been hearing quite a lot. And what I would like to say, at least, is that, well, this form of self-censorship, again, from some editors, confine themselves to a kind of sensationalist and miserable coverage of the subject when they talk actually about it. Because in their view, it's guaranteed to be an expectation of the readers. And so this, combined with a lack of time, a lack of means, and also sometimes a lack of knowledge, results in a biased media coverage on migration. And well, in France as well as in the rest of Europe, you know, from 2015 until now, like we can help but notice how this narrative was biased with three important features. First one would be that it's most of the time militaristic narrative. You know, when, well, we said that earlier, when we silence people. The second thing, it's also like confiscation of speech. Migrant people are not really able to speak in these particular pieces. And the third thing, which is really striking, and we can help but notice that in a lot of pieces, is that a lot of time reporters are getting confused with the terms, with the words. And for instance, they're using the word migrants, refugee, displaced, asylum seekers, and it was the same, even if it's like covering a really various kind of realities.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important point. It's just how much ignorance there is amongst, well, a lot of different groups around migration, and even amongst groups of people who really should know more and who should know better. And I'd just like to pick up on something else you said, because you're absolutely right that in France and indeed in a lot of other places, there isn't censorship in the way that a lot of people might consider the term. You don't literally have the government telling you what you can and can't write, for example. But we are using a broader definition of censorship, which is one which creates the kind of atmosphere that in which people do self-censor. Journalists, yes, also academics, activists, and of course people experiencing forced migration themselves. And there are also additional elements of censorship which may be comparatively small scale, but can be crucial to individuals in thriving on their journey. So something that I would like to raise, my own background is in working with refugees in various countries, and most recently with people in immigration detention in the UK. And I would say that there is a lot of censorship with regards to immigration detention here in the UK. For example, people are not allowed to take any kind of mobile phone into detention centres that have any kind of recording capability. So they can't take smartphones in, they can't take in anything that can take photos, that can record audio, that can record video. And that is to prevent word of what happens in there from getting out. And that is a form of censorship. It's not the government telling us what we can and can't say, but nonetheless, migrants' voices are being restricted. And I think that is a really important thing to bear in mind. We'll be discussing that more next week, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well, as, if you've got something to add to that. For now, though, I'd like to move on to the next question. Oh, but before I do, we've had some new attendees join, so I'd just like to invite them to submit any questions they have to the Q&A box. I will be relaying those questions to the panelists as they arrive. So the second question is, how can people put themselves forward without compromising their safety? Because we've already heard from Nina about the problem of self-censorship in a lot of different places and contexts. So how can people put themselves forward without compromising their safety? Shall we start with you this time, Lucy?
Okay, yes, I can have a go at that one. I think I did quite a lot. I started out, my first piece of research actually was working with asylum seekers who'd recently arrived in the UK, and this was back in the 1990s. And I was collecting their stories, not in a sense of tell me your story. I was just asking for people to comment on their lives at the time, really. And because I was doing it over sort of 2 or 3 years, it was really interesting to see how their stories developed as people grew to understand how they were living. You know, first of all, they were very pleased to be in a safe place. That was enough, that they were in a safe place. And then they started to sort of want more, and sort of develop a different sensibility to how their story was being told. But always the problem was that they had to tell an immigration story, and an immigration story that can't be changed, that once you've told your story, is become part of your asylum claim, then you're kind of stuck with that. And I think that system of people, before asylum seekers have been granted status as refugees, their stories become very fixed, and so they censor themselves because they're very afraid of saying something that's going to be seen as making their story not credible. And as I'm sure we all know, the worst thing to happen for somebody in the asylum process is to be considered not credible as a witness. So I think what I've kind of learned from that, in a way, is that perhaps we should be, to protect people and to allow them to sort of express themselves more clearly, instead of focusing on the individual story. My feeling is it's very powerful when people can come together and almost build a collective story, so that instead of asking the asylum seeker to say, why are you here, what happened to you, but to ask them to sit in the role of an expert in asylum seeking, or in seeking refuge, or in migrating. So rather than all these stories being sort of individual, and I think we have a bit of a passion sometimes to get a testimony from someone. I mean, testimony is really important, and the authenticity of someone's lived experience is really important, but the expertise and the learning that people have is also, I think, really important, and in a way allows people to step back from their own experience to comment on the wider picture. And I think certainly as an academic, I'm not asked for my experience. Nobody ever asked me how I came to be where I am. They're asking me to come up with some kind of expertise, whereas I've not been an asylum seeker. How am I supposed to know? But I've built whatever expertise I have, I've built it from learning and reading and all the rest of it. And I think we should be expecting that from migrants. So not necessary for them to have to repeat their story again and again and again, but they have a vast amount of experience to reflect upon. And that could be to reflect upon the asylum system, to reflect upon their treatment as they've been through Europe, to reflect upon their own experience of persecution, genocide, whatever it is. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think you make some really interesting points there about, well, yeah, I think it's very important to maintain a degree of humility when it comes to our own experiences and our own knowledge, because there's always more to learn. And as you say, it's not something that you or I have experienced directly ourselves. So I think that there does need to be some humility there, absolutely. Nina, would you like to talk about your perspective next?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I totally agree what's just being said. And beside humility, also maybe a sense of responsibility once again from some editors. And I'd like just to have like a counter example of that, which I found quite telling. Basically, the way we've treated reporters in Syria in the past years, because just what happened that between 2011 and 2019, 700 reporters were killed in Syria while doing their job. They are basically facing the risk of any country at war, like kidnapping, injury, death. And what I want just to highlight is the role of Western media, you know, because from 2012, Western media decided to stop sending reporters to the front. So instead, they employed local journalists to be freelancers or correspondents. And these freelancers and correspondents got pretty little financial, legal, medical support from the Western medias. And we were talking about that with an NGO, which is called ASML, which is working both in Syria and France in order to help reporters there. And they were just explaining, I found that quite telling once again, just to say that basically the way we see reporters in Syria, we see them as, and it was quite a fashionable term at the time, citizen reporters. It's important to enhance that, because what does it mean? It means that they are not really professional because they did not get any education in this field. So they would not be objective, they would have a kind of militant agenda, you know, and they have been in the past discredited for that. And what I found interesting in how like you are treated depends on your status. And tragically enough, freelancers do not know that they have rights, do not know that the media that employs them has obligations towards them. And it's particularly true for young reporters. There are less experiences, and therefore they will take more risks in order to produce exceptional contents. And they will get closer to the front line. It will get, you know, more dangerous. So it's just like a point about Syria, just to say that newsroom have responsibilities. And even if you're a freelancer, you also need to know that you have rights, and newsroom have obligations towards you. And so this is like a kind of just a side of like the physical safety, but I also like to say a few words about the psychological one, and particularly around the issue of trauma, because it's something that is often overlooked, you know, the mental health struggle people can experience in exile. And actually we did experience this, well, we are experiencing this on a daily basis inside our newsroom, because we are about 25 reporters, and half of us are coming, like are journalists in exile, you know, coming from Syria, Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, Zimbabwe, Chad. And we have had this issue from the beginning, because the trauma can take really different shape. And if you don't know about it, it could be also hard to approach. So we've decided to tackle this issue with 3 different things. The first thing is that we produce a document, which is a policy for the protection of fragile and vulnerable people, and it's basically prevent all the risks that that we can, you know, have in like the kind of re-traumatizing people if they have to relive. That was what Lucy said, you know, if they have to relive the journey over and over again. So basically, if they have to write about it, or because we also have a media education activity where we're going to school, to uni, to raise awareness around this topic, I mean, migration, but also freedom of press and freedom of speech. And it can also, you know, be an issue for reporters when they are going in a school. So it's basically a series of guidelines with all the solutions that we can come up with. And also what we did with, like, we've created 2 positions inside the newsroom of 2 counselors in the team. One is an exile person, the other one is a French one. And basically their job is just to check on the mental well-being of everyone. And the third thing is also the intervention of a professional psychologist if reporters need to speak to anyone.
Thank you. I mean, those sound like really positive developments to be working on. And that's awful that, well, firstly, I hadn't realized that it was so dangerous for journalists in Syria, and also that so many Western news agencies have hired them and made use of their talents and then essentially hung them out to dry. I hadn't realized that, so thank you. And finally, Gulwali, could we hear from you on this topic, please?
Sure, thank you. I completely agree with Lucy and Nina. And I think Lucy makes an important point about how we are always asked about our personal experience, not asked about the situation. So I have done hundreds of interviews in the last few years, especially since the publication of The Lightless Sky, and I get invited as an expert by experience. And I've been asked, oh, what is your story? Well, I could talk to you more than just my story. And, you know, I don't want to be just defined as this refugee guy. I want, you know, I did a politics degree. I did my master's in global governance, and I have an idea of the migration, citizenship, nationality, laws and rules in the UK immigration system and so on. And usually that, and also I think media systematically don't usually invite refugees. And when they do, they invite them for a specific purpose to tick a box to say they had a refugee on, and they don't give you much chance to explain and elaborate the story or the reasons. For example, I got invited to talk about the 39 people who were killed in the back of a refrigerator truck. And then there was somebody else sitting next to me who was supposed to give another side of the story. And also this guy, he'd written a book about dolphins or something. And I was like, well, I could talk on this subject overall, not just my experiences that I came from Cali to the UK in the back of a refrigerator truck, but I understand why these people are coming and why the failures of our policy and the hostile environment are, pushing people to these and the brinks of smugglers in these dangerous journeys. I could talk about this, but the media doesn't usually expect refugees to be experts in these things. And let's say nobody really asked her how did she become a researcher and how she become who she is. She will be asked about her opinion and perspectives and the subject matter. And I wish that was the case. And also, what I found in the last 5 years or so since being an advocate and campaigner for refugees' rights, I have so many friends who are refugees and doesn't want people to know they're refugees. They don't want people to know they are asylum seekers because they want to live a peaceful life. They don't want to be traumatized all over again. They don't want to be, answerable. They don't want to be accountable to people. And even I find it quite strange whenever I post a tweet or do something on social media or write an article and I read the comments, people are really saying miserable things. People saying things which is, racism. I mean, it's very hurtful. So recently, we saw with there was a journalist arrested in the Kent barricades, the military barricades, who was reporting on the situation there because the government is afraid, or the whomever is involved in this, they don't want the stories to go out there. And there's so much in the news about, how these people are there and how, they're criminals and they're threat to us, they're invaders and so on. But we don't really hear from these people themselves because there's a directly or indirectly, there's a process of not only dehumanization, but a process of silencing voices of refugees and asylum seekers. We don't want them to speak. And also the issue of credibility is very important. Most of us, because the Home Office put our credibility under question, and once you're disbelieved, there's very little you could do against the Home Office, then you automatically think, other people will not believe you. So you kind of stay silent. As Nina says, some people chose to be quiet about their experiences. So I would say, certainly we need to do more in terms of empowering asylum seekers to not only just tell their stories, but talk about their experiences, in an aspirational way. And I think, asking them where they are, what do they want to do, instead of asking them about their backstory. If they want to tell us, fine. The discussion we have today, even though I'm not an expert in this censorship debate, and it's great for me to be invited, I could talk about from my own experiences, but not like, I came from Afghanistan. Look, I'm a refugee and I went through a miserable experiences and journey, which is true, which I'm not saying that, we should not underestimate or should downgrade the suffering and the experiences of asylum seekers. But I feel like most of us we are more than just being refugees. We are activists, we are campaigners, we are writers, we are doctors, we are engineers, and we have our perspectives. I have a lot of refugee friends who are very good about policies. They have degrees, they have masters. I have a few friends who have PhDs and they're from refugee backgrounds. So that refugee should not define you. But I feel like, there's a lot being done by governments across the EU to make sure that the voices and the suffering and the condition of people are not known to the citizen. That's why there's the hostile environment. That's why people, not majority, but a sizable minority are against migrants, against asylum seekers, or against refugees, because we haven't been able to tell our side of the story. And the media, again, does it systematically to make sure that we only hear from the right-wing politician. We only hear from the likes of Nigel Farage. And again, the Home Office and the UK government, the language they uses is the language of UKIP. And it's very dangerous. And so I feel like on one hand, there's censorship going on. On the other hand, there's misinformation and propaganda by the state. And that's problematic.
Absolutely, that's a really important point. And I would even argue that misinformation and censorship are in some ways, two sides of the same coin. Misinformation is essential to the success of censorship, I think. And you're right, it is worrying how hostile the environment and the discourse and the conversation is around migration in much of the world. And it does a lot of people a real disservice, I think, to talk about it in that way. And as you say, most of the airtime is given to people like Nigel Farage, or in France, I guess, Marine Le Pen, people like that, who are really not the people you want to hear from on migration, since they don't seem to know anything about it.
Sure, and also in the UK, to be honest, a lot of the public are not aware. Like, for example, asylum seekers are not allowed to work. We have less than 1% of the refugee population in the UK. People are put in detention center indefinitely. We are one of the countries in Europe where we put people who have went through suffering and went through persecution, injustice, violence in this hellish journey. When they get here for safety and protection and asylum, which is their human rights, then we put them in a prison, semi-prison type situations where they're not being tried in the court of law. They're criminal without charges, without judge and jury, and they could be there for as many years and many months as we want. And so why can't, there have been so many opportunities for MPs to get this right. And there are people in the Conservative Party MPs who actually supports a limit and at 28 days or whatever, that there has to be a limit to put people in detention. I mean, in detention should not exist for refugees and asylum seekers, but unfortunately it does. And I think you'll be better if there was some sort of a limit. And a lot of people don't realize about, family reunification, how difficult it is to bring, if you're an unaccompanied minors, to bring your parents, or if you're a person with refugee status, to bring your spouse and relatives, or the laws are so restrictive, and the legal aid support and other supports are just not available, which used to be. So the government does, every year it makes it more and more hard. I mean, now the government is talking about an inadmissibility criteria. So if you come through a safer country, they will not even consider your asylum claim, which goes against international law. I mean, they're even considering sending asylum seekers to third countries who they're not citizen of. Anybody who can accept asylum seeker, let's say an Afghan comes here and Albania will accept them for whatever reason, they will send them. Like, how does that make sense? And yesterday, the health secretary was saying that people who come from the 33 countries on the red list of the new virus and stuff, we will quarantine them for 2 weeks and then deport them back to these countries. I'm like, really? How could you want to, it becomes so normal for the UK government to say things like they want to break international law in some limited form, in some specific and limited form. So I think and again, I think the government is purposely trying to connect the two together, to saying asylum seekers equals, a threat, a new virus. And so a lot has been done in the media and by politicians, and it's such heartbreaking situation, to be honest. We had Brexit and we had Trump in the States, and we have what Prentex is being investigated by the European Parliament because of their actions and their work in sending people back illegally in pushbacks, and how the work they have done in Hungary, and how in Croatia and other places. So there's been a lot of injustice done by authorities, by people who are supposed to protect people, but actually they're doing a lot more to protect borders. I mean, yeah, I say more and more, but I feel like asylum seekers and refugees needs to be given the platform as individuals with agency. So if they want to share their stories, fine, but they could talk about the topic. They could talk about the subject matter, and from their lived experience or from their academic experience or whatever. I think most asylum seekers and refugees have seen more than a lot of people could imagine, and I think they're well placed in speaking for themselves. I think it's always great having charity speaking for us. We need allies, we need supporters, but ultimately, we should be able to, people should not talk behind our back. People should talk to us rather than talking about us.
Absolutely, yeah, that's hugely important. I think in countering the kind of prevailing media narrative is, as you say, to actually talk to people directly and get the expertise from the people who actually know. We've had a question from our audience. Someone has asked, they'd like to know more about what the audience can do to help address these issues. So they're asking if anyone on the panel, and here I'll just, rather than ask a specific person to comment, I'll just open the floor. They've asked if any of you can make any recommendations on ways that the average person can take meaningful action to address some of these problems.
Shall I start?
Sure.
I think that's a very good question. I should say maybe, yeah, okay. That's a very good question, because I think, when people come in this kind of conversation and debate, it's good to take some sort of action. I think the things we could do, I mean, at times we feel overwhelmed and powerless and hopeless, because there are like 80 million displaced people, 30 million refugees, and the situation is terrible in the Greek islands and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, and even in the UK and in France and Paris and Calais. But I feel like things we could do, writing to our MPs, going, demonstrations are not allowed at the moment because of lockdown, but I mean, going on demonstration when it's possible, supporting local refugee charities, volunteering, going to the Greek islands, going to Calais, befriending refugees, mentoring, all these little things we could do, it will go a long way. I feel like, reading books like mine in stories, and actually most of these refugee charities, when you go on their website, they have a template letters already written, like, the Detention Forum, Ending Detention, Detention Action, Asylum Matters, Refugee Action, Refugee Council, City of Century, whomever. You go on their website, there will be a letter written. All you have to do is send it to your MP. You just put your postcode in and send it. And that makes a difference, having that discussion and debate with your MPs. And I just feel like, donating to charities who are on the front line, like local small groups, like, the Inside Collaborative and the Refugee Birani, the Banana and Birani charity. There's people who does some great work on the Greek islands and who needs funds, who needs support. So for example, if I'm not able to go there personally for whatever reason, I might be able to donate something. So all these little action that we take will make a difference and will have an impact.
Mm. Yeah, I think from my point of view, if I can jump in, and it is quite difficult to know sort of where to start sometimes, but I think doing the kind of, as Gulwali suggests, to sort of look at the local agencies around. But I think there are not many places where there are not refugees already living. I mean, we don't know that and we don't identify them as such. But I think just having a conversation, which again, I mean, admittedly is quite difficult at the moment, just striking up a conversation. But refugees are everywhere. And I think oftentimes, even amongst people who are second generation, we will all know people who have a refugee experience in their background, if not them themselves or their neighbours. Britain's been accepting, refugees are nothing new. I mean, there have been refugees in the UK for forever. And I think as far as migration goes, even people like me who are very rooted in my particular place, I am still a migrant. I still have some experience of moving in different countries and living that kind of cross-cultural life. So I think in a sense, it's about, we can do a lot by just being aware of what migration does for us now, even if it is just looking amongst our local communities and sort of what's there and who's operating, and just talking about it. I mean, it shouldn't be some sort of terrible secret that people have to sort of confess to having come from another country. It's normal part of life. And in a way now, at the moment, all of us who have been migrants like me, who have freely been migrants, we're all desperate to get out there and migrate again. I mean, we're all wanting to move about and are unable to do that. So although I'm not complete at all conflating my kind of voluntary migratory experience with somebody who's been forcibly displaced, but still, it is. I think we need to normalize migration and to sort of just, it's not, when we talk about migrants having a voice, they are just us, but it's a how do we listen? It's about, maybe what I'm saying is it's about listening rather than talking. And so we need to find some way to listen.
Thank you. Have you got anything you'd like to add to that, Nina?
Yeah, maybe just a few words, because in this change of narrative, which is important, media does have a responsibility, but I truly believe that readers and viewers have responsibility as well, and we tend to forget that sometimes. Well, for instance, if we take the example of fake news, only in France, I believe that we have like at least a fake news about migration every 2 weeks or so. Well, just told by political leaders, you were right, from the far-right party, but not only. The thing is, fake news won't be like increasing that much if people were also not, tend not to just believe it so quickly. And the thing is that, especially given to the fake news system, actually in France, like in any other countries in the world, it's basically built on 5 similar motives every time, like meaning security. When you let migrants enter in your country, it leads to terrorist attack. It's the first one, we're hearing quite a lot. The second one would be like the economic issue. We cannot welcome everyone because we don't have the financial support. Or also a third one would be like the cultural crisis, because if you have migrants from different parts of the world, then it would change your own culture and it's not good. I just believe as a reporter and as a citizen that we need to stay And I know how hard it's difficult when it comes to migration, you know, in this kind of debate, because it's so passionate, and a lot of people are just not responding with their head, but with their stomach. And as a reporter, I just want to warn with any other subjects, really, that just we have to answer with our head first, and just to question and to be curious about all the things all the time.
Absolutely, yeah. Of course, the media have a responsibility to print the truth, but equally, individual citizens have a responsibility to think critically and to analyse the information that they are reading themselves as well. And that actually feeds very well into another question we've received, which the questioner says is specifically for Nina, but open to everyone. And they're asking, how can we as citizens access ethical journalism by those in exile and asylum seekers and so on? And also, how can we demand more access to this sort of journalism and media from freelance journalists to larger outlets?
Well, I'll jump in. So I'd like to say, well, with Guiti News, but like a lot of other media outlets, well, what we've noticed in working in this field for 2 years now, I mean, media, you know, working with people in exile who are journalists and covering this field. In France, we are the only one doing that. And we have several partnerships, you know, in Europe, in Germany, or in Greece, or in Turkey, for instance, and they're trying to reproduce that as well. But it's kind of rare because it poses the lack of diversity in medias. And I'd just like to say, because I think this number is really like eloquent, but in France, we have an institution that welcome and hosts journalists in exile for a year, you know, allows them to get French classes. And the purpose of all of it is basically to help them, you know, to access Parisian newsroom. But in only 10% of the cases, journalists can actually do the job once they are in France, which is a total waste of competences and knowledges, you know, and it's basically what we are trying to do with our little means, just to help people who have this qualification, who have this expertise, you know, to keep on going. And I'd like to say just a last word, because it's even harder for women journalists in exile, because you have, well, the migration background, but then you have the gender, and then it's just more like double violent. And we all need to realize that in order to have like a richer news, we need to have journalists with a various kind of profile, you know, coming in the like different part of the world with different languages, different culture, and it will just make the information even more interesting and rich.
It sounds like a lot of it is about, well, to use the expression, voting with our feet, in terms of actually deliberately choosing to consume media written by journalists with kind of direct lived experience, and choosing to support people who might otherwise have more trouble breaking through, and maybe also actively seeking out journalism and information from areas which we aren't familiar with ourselves. So it sounds like a lot of it is just about giving the clicks and the subscriptions and the support directly to people who are already doing that work. Lucy Gulwali, I know that question was addressed directly to Nina, but would you like to add something, or shall I move on to the next question?
I think that there are some really good organizations supporting writers and journalists in the UK as well. I just forgot the name. There is one Chatterbox. There is Speakers for Refugees. I think it's good to connect with them and to offer any help and support. I mean, there are really good journalists around who will be willing to give training and perhaps, you know, connect them. I think because a lot of refugees are unaware of how to access and be signposted. So it will be good to find all these like institutions and places where you can get qualification, you can get some English classes or whatever language classes you want, and just be, you know, have that network will definitely help.
I mean, as somebody who's not particularly tied into those networks, I mean, I would, if there was anything that you, Daniel, could do in your good offices, or to put together sort of lists of resources, I think those kind of things, very simple, just kind of recommending, one site recommending another, and putting links up. And I think that's something we can definitely share opinions on, because I mean, in my experience, a lot of things that I have read a lot, then they run their course and they change, and it needs to be sort of updated in a way that, to keep it current. And yeah, I'm very lazy, so if you can do it for me, that'd be great.
Well, I actually think that's a really good idea, and I will definitely discuss that with my colleagues, because I really like the idea of having a section of our website dedicated to media that actually focuses on these issues in a sympathetic and experienced manner. So I think that's a fantastic idea, and I'll definitely take that to the rest of the team. I'll move on to our third question next, and then open the floor to any final questions. And the third question is, what recommendations would you make to humanitarian actors and also to people experiencing displacement for sharing the reality of these situations? Let's see, who have we? Gulwali, would you like to start us off on this one?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a little difficult, because I mean, for humanitarians, we just want them to be aware, to be informed, to be educated about the work, in the importance of their work, and kind of be non-judgmental, which I'm sure most people are. People who go out, and it's really admirable that there are individuals, people leaving their families and their loved ones, and actually going and volunteering and spending months and years and supporting those displaced people. That's great. But I think for the displaced people, it's for us, I think it's for refugees, it's really important for us to feel safe, as Lucy was saying earlier, and to be able to not be in a constant legal limbo, and not be in credibility question, and live in fear of what's going to happen to you, and living in a refugee camp for years without a site, and being detained, or for example not allowed to work, and so there is so many issues. But I think the most important thing is the advice I would give is to not lose hope, stay hopeful. There are a lot of good in the world. There are a lot of good people in the world who will support you. And I think, people are displaced sadly because of, circumstances and situation and events out of their control. I mean, I am where I am because of the empathy and sympathy and solidarity and help and support of individuals and people who believed in me and supported me as a mentored me and befriended me and helped me with, learning English and getting on with my life. So I think there are a lot of wonderful people out there. So I would just say, not losing hope, staying positive, and looking, as Nina was saying earlier, about mental health and emotional well-being. That's really important. And sometimes there are people who could be stranded on the Greek islands for years without sight and in difficult conditions. It's hard to say to them to not lose hope, but I think we should put the pressure and get their voices and their situation out there to human rights organizations and like the UN. UNHCR needs to do a lot more, and so on and so forth, and put pressure on governments to provide humane solutions to these problems. But I would just say, just being active, being engaged with the process, not losing your perseverance, and staying active and proactive about the situation and condition you're experiencing. Not just staying there and thinking someone else will do it for you. You got to make the effort, and you have to be dedicated. I know it's not easy, but especially if you're in situation and circumstances where you feel depressed, you have anxiety, you're isolated, you're missing your loved ones, or you have gone through a terrible experience of violence and persecutions and injustices and so on. But I feel like it's just like there is a hopefully light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really good to hear your optimism there, because I think with a lot of these webinars, it's very easy to get very depressed about the state of things, and especially with today's one when we're talking about such hostile media narratives and there are such vast forces that, or it can seem like there are such vast forces arrayed against us. So it's actually lovely to hear some optimism and some and this idea that we just have to, each of us, make that effort. So I think that's really good to hear. Nina, could we hear from you next, please?
Sure. Sorry, I found I was a bit not too optimistic myself either in the past conversation. But I have to say that in this past year, I feel like we have been seeing a lot of interesting initiatives that are aiming in a really different ways, to tackle this issue. And this is kind of encouraging. For the question, I think there's two aspects of it to people working in this sector, you know, humanitarian actors, NGOs, or institutionals in general. I don't know how to phrase this exactly, but maybe just to pay attention, and it could sound a bit naive, but just to pay attention that the person you have in front of you is simply a person before being a refugee, because it's something I've been noticing a lot with some people, you know, like we are working with, you know, and sometimes they have really good intentions, but with them, they're actually ending by stigmatizing people even more, you know. So first, maybe pay attention to that and the way like we address each other, first thing. And second, well, for obviously for reporters and newsroom, just for migration like topics, like any other topics, just to stick on and to build on the central principle of journalism, which are like accuracy of facts, independence, impartiality, responsibility, and also like rely on facts without taking sides. It's really important because when it comes to migration, it's such a complex thing. You need to be specific, you need to be precise. And the second aspect would be to pay attention to using the right terminology. What I was, saying earlier, I think it's essential, really, it's vital to be familiar with the exact terms and the law. Third thing, obviously, to show humanity, because when you're interviewing people, of course you're a reporter, but you're also a human being, and you need to pay attention to the way you address, the questions, especially with all these psychological aspects we mentioned earlier. And finally, just to protect those who take the risk of expressing themselves, because there could also be retaliation sometimes, and they need to know that it's, something that might happen. So just pay attention to that. And last thing, sorry, is just to protect from hate, with this massive increase of fake news. I found it super important to be attentive to information that could be used to preach hate.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's hugely important to always kind of critically analyze information and to always do everything we can to counter hate, essentially, because that's what we're all trying to do, really. That's why we're all here, is to counter that. Lucy.
I think these are really, really good points you've just been making, and I think the point about skills is really important, and to build people's confidence in speaking for themselves, and this whole issue of safety. I think also we've talked, you've mentioned about detention and the long periods of immobility that, we talk about migration and we think of it as being something that is, people are moving, but oftentimes in the process of moving, they're actually stuck. And that does give an opportunity, if it can be taken, to sort of actually to develop the skills of people and to build up people's skills in expressing themselves, and in building up a story and a strength. Because I think I have had some small experience of working with people with lived experience of poverty in the UK, and these are British people who are living in poverty. And the thing that makes the real importance for them of being able to express their own story is taking the time to build up trust, so that they can begin to express the things that they have held back within themselves, that the stigma of talking about being sort of an asylum seeker, of being somebody living in poverty, can be very extreme. So the time taken to feel confident to talk about one's story and to realize one's expertise, one's knowledge, and all the rest of it, I think that's really important. So it takes time. It is a job, and as far as possible, we should be paying people for their information and not expecting them to, which is really what Nina started with. It's not the whole issue of recognizing people there. And to allow people time to reflect on their stories as well. I think that's really important, that reflecting with other people who've had a shared experience. And I think I was in a meeting a little while ago, and somebody came up with this phrase that collaboration is resistance. And I thought that was really nice, because it's not one person's job to do any of this. The important thing is for people to share information, and that from that shared collaboration, you can build a sort of resistance. And I think collaboration brings in this issue of trust. It can help people through the really practical issues of needing interpreters for whichever languages they're going into. So if you can collaborate and work with people who are trusted, that allows people to sort of find their voice. And I think we also need to recognize that when people are on the move, when people are facing, you know, really a huge assault on their psychological well-being and their sense of self, stories tend to be reactive, and they tend to change. They can change very quickly, and it's actually very difficult to work out what you're really trying to say. What is really the issue here? So rather than being forced to respond to the question from the outside, from, you know, a policymaker or from a politician, I think we need to hear what migrants want to tell us, not what we think we need to know. So I'm saying the same thing again, really, in a different way, but I think that's really important. And I think the more we can, as myself as an outsider to all this, to support that space for people to talk, I think that's what I see my role as being, is to try to offer a space.
Absolutely, yeah, I think that's a really good point as well, actually, that kind of idea of creating a space. And I think that's something that Insight itself is doing as well, is with these webinars, is kind of creating a space for people to discuss these issues and for people to ask questions of the panelists as well. We've had another question, and I think it will be a really good question to finish on. So again, I won't ask this to any particular person, but instead just anyone who has any thoughts on it, please do come forward with them. We've had someone ask, what do the speakers think the future of censorship will look like? And are they hopeful?
Who wants to go first?
Going in.
Well, I am hopeful. If I can jump in, I'm hopeful because I teach migration studies. So this allows me to talk to students and to learn from them. And I think there are many people who are really passionate about these issues. And I think that these events are really good at bringing people together, and all kind of, I think one thing about living our lives on Zoom, it means I've taken part in conversations all across the world, one way or another. That's really important. But I think there is people I'm speaking, you know, my students are generally sort of 20s, 30s. They have a different view of the world, and they're not as passive probably as I was at their age. And I think I'm really encouraged by what I see from young people who are getting engaged as humanitarians, as advocates, whatever, all of that.
Yeah, I think you know, we need to stay positive and be hopeful. Otherwise, because it's depressing. The world is in such a mess, and I feel like, you know, I just remember a beautiful quote from a power privilege booklet by an Australian Aborigine activist who said, you know, if you come here to help me, then you are in the wrong place. But if you come here because your freedom is bound to mine, then, you know, we could work together. I think for humanitarians and for activists working with refugees, let's not see them as victims. Let's not see them as people who need help, but let's work together with them, because they could bring something to the table and they will have something to offer. And I would just say, you know, it's good to see the young people are more, you know, globalized and internationalist and outward looking. And particularly we see with the global pandemic, I mean, if things happens in Brazil or in China or in South Africa, it impacts us here. If things happens in the UK, it impacts people elsewhere in the world. And same with conflicts and wars in Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan, you know, Ethiopia, whatever. When things happens, then it has, we live in a very interlinked worlds. And so I feel like I just want us to be caring and considerate and want to concern about the suffering of our fellow human beings, to take action, to do whatever little or lot that we could do. And I just feel like we all have it within ourselves to make a stand, to challenge the negative rhetorics, the lies and the misinformation, And I think, in the West, particularly, we're in a much better position than people in the East or people in the Middle East, where they have authoritarian regimes in government where they can't really speak out openly. Perhaps, they will end up being imprisoned. So I think we should take our privileges seriously and, not waste an opportunity, not take it for granted that we have a voice. I mean, I could say whatever I want to say, but I may not be able to say the same thing when I'm in Afghanistan, perhaps. So when I'm, like there's been a lot of protests by the Pashtun Tahappuz movement, the Pashtun protection movement in Pakistan, and they keep getting arrested because the state doesn't want them to have a voice, to speak for their rights, and to ask the states, to be responsible and to speak against the army and so on. So in the UK, I feel like no matter the situation is quite bad and hostile, but ultimately we do have the freedom, and I think with social media and access to YouTube, and we could do our own things without the mainstream media. We could still get our voices heard, and by telling stories, by sharing information, it goes a long way. And I think, yeah, we have it within ourselves to touch people's lives, and let's do it in a good way.
Thank you. Have you got anything to finish up with, Nina?
Well, such a hard work to finish after that. No, myself, I'm quite optimistic for the future, and again regarding migration and regarding journalism, because from where I'm standing, I have to say that I think we've raised awareness enough, and now people are more conscious, of this issue. Not only this one, but really, all the question about intersectionality, for instance, so this makes me confident for the future, and I do feel like in this battle also the semantic is proeminent, super important. So we need to keep on underlining which words to be really specific with the words, especially as reporters, but we're getting there.
Thank you. Well, there you have it, folks. The future could well be very positive, but it's up to us to make that happen. That brings us to the end of today's webinar. We have another one at the same time next Wednesday, also about censorship, with a panel of people with experience of immigration detention centres and refugee camps talking about censorship and the suppression of their voices. So if you're free, then please do attend. It should be a really interesting discussion. And I'll just close today by saying a huge thank you to our three amazing panelists, Gulwali Passarlay, Lucy Williams and Nina Gheddar. You've all been brilliant. And thank you very much. I hope we can have you on board for another discussion again soon.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks for having us, and thanks for the good work that you guys do.
Thank you.
Stay safe, everyone. Nice to see you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and thank you for organising, Daniel.
Yeah.
Lovely to meet you all.
You too. Have a lovely evening. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.